Okay, so sometimes life kind of throws these curveballs at you, and you're like, okay, got to reevaluate some things here. And it's funny, these excerpts you sent in, like from Brené Brown's Dare to Lead, they feel kind of like that right now, you know?
Oh, absolutely. It's like Brené Brown just has this uncanny way of showing up exactly when we need her most, right?
Right. Like it's no coincidence.
No coincidence at all.
Hmm.
And I think what's really cool about the parts you picked out, they don't just tell us like what courageous leadership is. They really dig into the how. How do we actually do this? How do we become those leaders?
Yes, exactly. And that's what I love about her work. So one of the things that really jumped out at me was how she just totally busts that myth that being vulnerable is weak.
Yeah, yeah.
It's actually like the total opposite, isn't
And
it?
totally. Everything she talks about, all her research just points back to that. Vulnerability is the foundation. Like if you want to be courageous, you got to do the vulnerability thing first.
It's about being real, being authentic, even when it feels like kind of scary.
Yes. Even when it feels super risky. Remember that story she tells
Yeah.
about the engineer who was like, if I get all vulnerable, like shit might fall from the sky.
Oh my gosh, yes.
Classic Brené Brown, right?
It's so true, though. Like, we get so caught up in this idea that it's all or nothing. Like, oh, if I'm going to be vulnerable, I got to tell everyone my deepest, darkest secrets.
Right, oversharing.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not about that. It's about finding that sweet spot of, like
being genuine.
being genuine without going overboard.
And one of the big things she talks about, this myth that we can just like opt out of vulnerability. Like it's a choice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to be vulnerable today.
Nope, not doing it. But the truth is, it's happening whether we want it to or not. The question is, are we going to be intentional about it
Or are we just going to let it happen to us?
Exactly.
Oh, that's good.
And I think a good example of that, like if you're avoiding a conversation that you know you need to have.
Because you're scared of the outcome.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's vulnerability right there. You're avoiding it because you're vulnerable.
Ooh, that's so true.
And that kind of takes us to another big thing you pulled out. Trust. Building trust in ourselves and with other people. I thought it was really interesting how she said, it's not these big grand gestures,
No, it's the little things.
the
Yeah.
small everyday moments.
Like that story she tells
Okay.
about her friend who remembered some, like, tiny detail
Right.
about her, and it meant the world to her.
It's about just like showing up,
Yeah.
being present, actually listening, not just pretending to listen,
Yeah.
really listening.
And then just, like, consistently showing that you care.
It's funny because sometimes it means you have to trust first.
Yes. You have to be vulnerable first to build that trust.
So it's like this.
It's a dance.
It's a total dance between the two. Vulnerability and trust.
Back and forth.
And both of those require us to know like what we stand for, our values.
Oh, 100%.
And that's where things get tricky.
Because a lot of us, we have a hard time even figuring out what our values are,
It's true.
let alone actually living them out.
We want these like big, lofty values, but we don't know how to like make them real. And I think what's helpful, Brené Brown talks about this, just pick one or two, values that really mean something to you.
Okay.
And then think about it like, okay, if I really live by this value, what does that look like? What do I actually do?
So it's like a roadmap almost for how we want to be in the world.
Totally. And I think it's especially helpful in those moments where it's tough, when we're tempted to fall back on those armored leadership tactics that she talks about.
The armor.
Yeah, like we all do it, numbing ourselves out with work, with food, scrolling on our phone.
Are you spying on me?
But it's true, right? We all do it.
Yeah. And you know what? I never thought about it as armor before reading her book, but cynicism, like being cynical about stuff or being sarcastic all the time,
Totally a defense mechanism.
I can be so damaging.
Oh yeah, just erodes trust, makes everything negative.
And then there's the whole controlling thing.
Leading by control, demanding compliance.
Which, I mean, come on, that never works long term, does it?
No, not at all. Think about a time when you felt micromanaged, or like you were just going through the motions at work.
Soul crushing.
The worst. And it's the opposite of creativity and good ideas, because it doesn't let people bring their full selves to the table.
So, if we're not supposed to do that, the armor thing, what's the alternative? What does Brené Brown say?
Well, she talks about this thing called painting done.
Painting done. What is that?
It's basically, instead of just telling people what to do, you give them the whole picture. Like, why are we doing this? What's the big overarching goal?
So they understand how their piece fits into the whole thing.
Exactly. And when people feel like their work means something,
It changes everything.
right, it's not just checking a box, it's I'm part of something bigger here.
Okay, that totally makes sense. But being a leader is not all about like giving instructions and painting the big picture. There's this whole other layer of navigating all the feelings.
The human stuff.
Yeah, all the messy human emotions. And that can be really hard.
Oh, 100%.
Yep.
And that's where like empathy comes in.
Okay, so tell me about that empathy. What does Brené Brown say about it?
So first, she's really clear that it's not the same as sympathy.
Okay, so what's the difference?
Sympathy is more like, oh, I'm sorry you're feeling that way. But empathy is about actually connecting with what someone's feeling, not trying to fix it or downplay it.
Oh, that's good.
And she tells this story that always gets me about missing her daughter's hockey game and how her colleague responded, her friend, just with so much empathy by simply saying, I know.
Oh my gosh, yeah. Just, I know.
It's such a powerful reminder that sometimes the best thing we can do is just be present, be there with someone in their pain without judgment.
That is powerful. And it kind of ties back to that whole idea of supporting each other through the tough stuff, the failures, the setbacks. And I love how Brené Brown says to think about failure not as something to be afraid of, but as a chance to learn.
Yes, to learn and to grow from it.
And you know, I think that's a really crucial skill for younger generations because they get told, you can be anything you set your mind to. You can do anything.
Right, which is great in theory.
It's inspiring, but it's not the whole story.
No, it's not, because challenges happen, setbacks happen, it's part of life.
Exactly. And if you've never been taught how to deal with those bumps in the road, it's easy to just get stuck in shame and self-doubt.
100%. And, she talks about this framework for approaching those tough conversations, like when things get hard. She calls it the anatomy of a rumble.
Okay, the anatomy of a rumble. So how do we dissect that?
Well, she starts with these things she calls shitty first drafts.
Shitty first draft.
Yeah, they're those initial stories we tell ourselves when we're upset or triggered. They're usually kind of messy and fear-based.
Oh, those. We've all got those.
We all do. And often, we don't even realize we're telling ourselves these stories, but they drive our reactions.
Okay, so what are we supposed to do with those shitty first drafts?
She actually recommends writing them down,
Oh, interesting.
because getting them out of our heads and onto paper can help us look at them more objectively.
So we can start to untangle them.
Exactly. And often when we do that, we realize those stories are full of assumptions and worst-case scenarios.
We jump to conclusions instead of actually getting the facts straight.
Exactly. And that brings us to the next part of the rumble. Conspiracy theories. We convince ourselves that something is true, even when there's no evidence.
It's amazing how good our brains are at creating drama, even when there isn't any.
It's true. It's like we'd rather be right, even if it means being miserable. And then there are the confabulations. Confabulations. They're those lies that we tell ourselves.
Yeah.
And we actually believe them to try to make sense of things.
So it's not that we're intentionally lying.
No, we genuinely believe these stories.
Yeah.
Which is what makes them so tricky to deal with.
Because if you believe something is true, it's really hard to see it any other way.
Right. And that's why she talks about the importance of reckoning with our emotions, paying attention to how our bodies feel when we're triggered.
It's like tuning in to those physical sensations.
Exactly. Because our bodies give us clues about what's going on emotionally. Like she talks about getting this tingling in her armpits when she's triggered.
Oh my gosh, yes. It's hilarious and so relatable.
Right. It's about developing that self-awareness so we can pause and ask ourselves, okay, what am I feeling right now and why?
Which is way easier said than done, let's be honest.
It takes practice. It's
Yeah.
not something you just figure out overnight.
It really is a practice. Like anything else we want to get good at, we got to practice it. And speaking of practice, it made me think about something else Brené Brown talks about. It's not enough to just work on ourselves in isolation.
Right.
Like it has to translate to the people around us.
100%.
Yeah.
It's about the culture we create in our teams, our workplaces, our families even.
Totally. So how do we do that? How do we take those personal aha moments and make them bigger than ourselves?
Well, it starts with role modeling, right?
Mm-hmm.
We can't expect people to be vulnerable if we're not willing to be vulnerable ourselves.
Right. So like walking the talk.
Exactly. And then, encouraging feedback,
Mm-hmm.
making it clear that we actually want to hear what people think, even if it's not always easy to hear.
Being open to hearing it.
And then celebrating those moments when people do take risks, even if they don't always work out. Because that's how we learn, right?
It's like those learning moments instead of failures.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's a huge part of creating a courageous culture, allowing people to mess up, without feeling like they're going to get punished for it.
So it's okay to not have all the answers, to admit when we don't know something.
It's more than okay. It's actually essential. Because when we pretend to have it all figured out, we stop being open to new ideas, new ways of doing things. And that's the death of innovation right there.
Makes you wonder if some of the best learning moments come from those mistakes, the things that didn't go as planned.
Oh, absolutely. It's like that saying, you learn more from your failures than your successes. And, Brené Brown talks about this too, how we can actually reframe our relationship with failure.
Okay, so how do we do that? Because most people, failure is not their favorite thing.
It's true. No one likes to fail. But what if, instead of seeing it as this big, scary thing, we looked at it as data?
Data.
Yeah, like information. Every time we try something and it doesn't work out, we're gaining valuable information about what doesn't work and what we might need to adjust.
So it's not about being bad at something. It's about, okay, what can I learn from this?
Exactly. It's about shifting that internal dialogue from, I'm a failure, to, okay, this is interesting. What can I do differently next time?
Yeah.
A much more empowering way to look at things.
It is. And, thinking about it, that makes me think about something else. This whole idea of not being able to give what you don't have. If you're constantly beating yourself up, being super hard on yourself.
You're not going to have a lot of compassion left over for other people.
Exactly.
And it goes back to that self-compassion piece we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
We have to be kind to ourselves, especially when we mess up.
Because we all mess up, right? It's part of being human.
Exactly. And if we can offer ourselves that same grace and understanding that we would offer a good friend, it makes a world of
It
difference.
really does. It's like those rumbles Brené Brown talks about, those tough conversations, those moments of conflict, they can actually be opportunities for growth, both for us personally and for our relationships.
100%. But it takes a certain level of awareness to see it that way.
And that's where those tools she talks about, reckoning with our emotions, they come in handy, right?
Exactly. We can learn to pause, take a breath, and just notice what we're feeling in those moments without judgment.
It gives us more space to choose a skillful response.
Yes. Instead of just reacting from that place of fear or insecurity.
Which is often our default, let's be real.
Oh, for sure.
Huh?
But the more we practice, the easier it gets to catch ourselves in those moments and choose a different path.
It's funny, as we're kind of wrapping up here, thinking about all this, I realize Brené Brown's take on leadership, it's not just about, being in charge at work.
Well, totally. He even says it straight out.
Yeah.
It's about being brave in all parts of your life.
Exactly. It's about showing up as your true self, being authentic, whether you're at work, at home, wherever.
It's about bringing that same courage to your relationships, to your community, even to just, how you move through the world.
Yes. It's like that quote, be the change you want to see. It all starts with us.
100%. And being authentic doesn't mean you got to share every single thing about yourself with everybody.
Oh, right. That's not what it's about.
If you get to choose.
Yeah, who gets to see those deeper parts of ourselves?
Exactly. And setting boundaries.
Yeah.
It's brave to say no sometimes.
That's a really good point. We can be courageous and still protect our own well-being. Which, speaking of well-being, I feel like we should touch on that for a sec. Self-care.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So important.
Because you can't show up for other people if you're totally drained yourself, right?
Totally. You can't pour from an empty cup, as they say.
It's true. And I think for a lot of us, that means unlearning some stuff. This idea that we have to be on all the time.
Oh, yeah, that hustle culture mentality.
It's exhausting. And Brené Brown talks about this too. Self-care isn't selfish.
It's the opposite. It's essential.
So what are some things, practical things that we can do to make sure we're taking care of ourselves?
Well, it's different for everyone, right?
Okay, so it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Right. For some people, it might be meditating every morning. For others, it might be going for a run, or reading a good book, or just taking a bath.
Taking a bath, yes.
The important thing is to figure out what works for you, what fills your cup, and then make it a priority.
Don't let those things slide off the schedule.
Exactly. Because it's not just about feeling good, it's about showing up as the best version of ourselves, for ourselves and for the people around us.
It kind of brings us back to courage again, doesn't it?
How so?
Well, it takes courage to say, look, I'm going to prioritize myself here. I'm going to take care of my own needs.
Especially in a world that tells us we should be go, go, go all the time.
Totally. So as we're wrapping up our little deep dive here into Dare to Lead, I'm curious, what's something that really stuck with you? Like one thing you're going to take away from all of this.
Honestly, it's that idea of those small daily acts of courage. They really do add up.
It's not always about those big, grand gestures.
Exactly. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is just like speak up in a meeting when we have something to say, or set a boundary with a coworker, or even just like challenge that negative self-talk that we all have going on in our heads.
Yes, it's about recognizing those opportunities for courage in those everyday moments.
Exactly. And remembering that it's a practice. It's not about being perfect.
We're all just figuring it out as we go.
Exactly. And that's okay.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to wrap it up here. It's been so great chatting with you about all this.
Yes. This was fun. Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Brené Brown's Dare to Lead. We hope you'll join us again next time.